Good evening. This is the Town of Chatham Planning Board hybrid meeting, December 9, 2024 at 5 p.m. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be available shortly thereafter for scheduled and on-demand viewing on any smartphone or tablet device. If anyone else is recording the meeting, please notify the chair. And I see no one. Pursuant to Governor Healy's March 29, 2023 signing of the Acts of 2023, extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency, suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 20, until March 31st, 2025, this meeting of the Chatham Planning Board is being conducted in person and via remote participation. Every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings as provided for in the order. A reminder that persons who would like to listen to this meeting while in progress may do so by calling the phone number 1-508-945-4410, conference ID 928-243-604#, or join the meeting online via Microsoft Teams through the link in the posted agenda. While this is a live broadcast and simulcast on Chatham TV, formerly Channel 18, despite our best efforts, we may not be able to provide for real-time access. We will post a record of this meeting on the town's website as soon as possible. I'd like to begin with a roll call. Catherine Halpern.
Catherine Halpern, present.
Warren Chain.
Warren Chain, present.
Bob Werschafter.
Bob Werschafter, present.
Charlene Greenhall.
Charlene Greenhalgh, present.
Frank Shear.
Frank Scherer, present.
Bob Dubus.
Bob Dewis, present.
And Art Sprue, I'm present. I'd like to begin with a review of minutes from, let's begin with the November 18th, 2024. Are there any comments or questions from the board members on these minutes?
I did send an email to Annie, just letting her know just a couple things. One, it should be planning board work session meeting minutes, not regular meeting. And then also the vote to adjourn on the back should be a vote of 7-0 and include Bob, because you were there.
Great.
And with that said, I would move approval as amended.
Okay. And do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, I'll do a roll call vote on this. Catherine Halpern.
I approve.
Warren Chain.
Warren Chain, approve.
Bob Werschafter.
Bob Werschafter, approve.
Charlene Greenhall.
Charlene Greenhalgh, approve.
Frank Shear.
I approve.
Bob Dubus.
Bob Dubus, approve.
And Art Sprue, I approve. Okay, next we will go to the minutes of November 25th, 2024. Any comments or questions about this one?
I had three minor items. Under also present, town council was there remotely, so it should say remote. Down towards the bottom of the page, the motion, this is under the request for release of bond, and also Annie, I already gave all this to her. A motion was made by myself, seconded by Bob, to release the bond and accrued interest. Okay. And then on page 3, the first full paragraph, a member suggested increasing Zone A. I suggested that it read, a member suggested increasing the depth of Zone A, just to make it clear what we were talking about.
I also had a similar one for, at page 2, it was in the middle of the paragraph, West Chatham Neighborhoods Center discussion, and I think this second, third sentence, I was not clear on that, and I asked for an adjustment. Really what we were talking about is balancing between commercial, for a certain percentage between commercial and residential. And why don't you read what you're suggesting as an adjustment?
So what I've suggested is that I'll read the entire paragraph if you don't mind. Mr. Spounch, gave a brief overview explaining that the board would need to consider the build-out analysis scenarios presented by BSC Group and DPW's analysis of the infrastructure capacity of the neighborhood center area. He said that they saw far more development than expected in the build-out analysis and that much of the development was residential. The board had previously changed or removed language about commercial properties from the proposed bylaw, and therefore the balance between commercial/residential does not appear as intended, instead of feels off. The goal is for a mixed-use village center, and this is not solely a residential use. The DPW letter said that the gravity systems can handle the increased flow, but the existing pump station would not be able to. So there were just some minor wording changes.
Yeah, minor words, but it shows the balance between the residential, okay. Any other adjustments? Frank?
On page 3, way down at the bottom, a member asked about limiting short-term rentals. And it says that, Mr. Tallerman said, and I think it would be clearer if we deleted what was after said and inserted. Mr. Tallerman said that short-term rentals can be limited or prohibited within the district.
I agree that that's accurate. Yes.
Okay, with those changes, do it.
I move approval of the meeting minutes as amended.
I'll second that.
I'll do a roll call vote. Catherine Halpern,
I approve the minutes as amended.
Warren Chain,
Warren Chain, approve.
Bob Werschafter,
Bob Wertheimer, approve.
Charlene Greenhall,
Charlene Greenhalgh, approve.
Frank Shear,
Frank Scherer, approve.
Bob Dubus,
Bob Dubus, approve.
and Art Spur, I approve. Okay. Next business item is certificate of compliance and request for bond release. This is 859 Main Street. Dave Clark is, I assume you're going to be presenting?
Good evening, David Clark, Clark Engineering, on behalf of 859 Main LLC. If you've driven by it, which you probably have, you can see it is substantially complete at this point. All the pavement's in, all the drainage is in, all the landscaping's in, all the lighting. As I stated in my cover letter, the only thing remaining is the easterly sidewalk connection to the marketplace. I also provided the state's 25% design plan for the intersection, which shows something significantly different than what they're tried to get us to do on that same stretch. So we held off installing that section primarily because there's a public shade tree on that corner, which was mentioned at the meetings when we were going through the permitting stage. When I look at the state's plans, I think that tree can be saved, and that's, again, that's the primary reason why we haven't done that work. And so, like I said, that's the only outstanding infrastructure that has not been installed. I think the state is planning to go to 75% design drawing sometime late next year, 2026. So it will be resolved one way or the other in the next few years. And I just hate to take that tree out if it can be saved. I think the town has more leverage than we do. I tried to bring it to the state's attention, and they didn't seem to care. But if the community gets behind saving that tree, it'll get saved.
Well, there's actually two there, right? One in each of the islands. There's two.
Well, the larger tree around the corner is well outside of
Okay.
what the state's planning. It's the one that, you see the 3 parking spaces we have
Right.
on the east side. It's right in the middle of the it's right in the middle parking space, and it's a couple of feet to the north of that.
Okay.
So, that's it for my presentation.
Okay, any comments or questions of Dave regarding this release, bond release?
Looks great.
Yeah. Catherine?
And first of all, I want to say I've driven by it many times, and that property looks really good. A huge improvement over what it was before, and a great improvement for the town as a whole. So I did want to make that comment. I just want to know, you're saying that eventually that sidewalk may get constructed.
It will,
It
one way or
will.
the other, because the state does have a plan, and they are moving forward. The last
Okay.
25% plan, I think, is dated July of this year, so they are still moving forward, slowly, but they are.
So is there a portion of the performance bond that would be allocated to build that sidewalk in future that maybe we wouldn't, that we would still hold back? And what would that amount be?
I don't know what that amount would be. The state's plan is completely different than what they permitted
Okay,
for us to do, so
so it's an unknown,
it's unknown in that if we were to install it, it would get, doesn't fit with what the state's planning for the intersection, so it would all come out. The rest of what we've done is part of their plan. I think what they're thinking of doing is making the walking service another 2 feet, so it's a shared use. But other than that, all the curbing's going to be the same. It's just the curbing on the east end is definitely going to change when the state moves forward with theirs. So
Okay.
nothing we put in the ground is going to stay more than 4 years.
Bob Dumas?
Dave, who's responsible for that sidewalk?
Town of Chatham.
Mike Bob.
Mike,
Dave, who's responsible for, the town of Chatham is responsible for that section of sidewalk?
All the sidewalks on 28.
No, but why you've already put money into building a sidewalk there.
The state required it.
Okay. So who's responsible that section when the state does what they want to do there? Is it
It'll
going
be
to come back to you guys? And they're
I
going to
don't
say,
think they're going to.
you didn't put the sidewalk in there, so we want it this way now.
Who knows? But if they go forward with it, it's a very small portion of the overall project when they redo that
I
intersection.
understand. So how about either some, to keep some of the monetary value, or I would even go with a letter, a drafted letter stating that if the state doesn't put that little piece of sidewalk in, that they're still responsible to build it. And then I would release all the money, as long as they would give us a certified letter stating that if the state makes them put that in, that they're willing to pay for it, not the town of Chatham.
I don't know who's paying for the intersection reconstruction. I imagine the state is.
I'm just saying, because it's on to them to put the sidewalk in. And I understand that it might not go there, and that they want their money back. But I think a certified letter saying, if the state said, hey, you need to put this in when they're building it, or if they just automatically hook into it, then there's no problem. I would think that would be an alternative where they can get their money, but they're still responsible as the state for that little piece, unless the state does something weird,
Well,
which is normal.
I get where you're coming from.
Trying to make it as easy as I can
Yeah,
for you,
yeah,
but
I
but somebody has to be responsible for it
I know what he's getting.
because it's on the plan.
$1,000 back or something.
In theory, that would work with the exception that the state is not going to keep what we put in the ground.
I understand that. That's why I'm trying to give
And
you
we
an
would
out.
not be responsible for the change.
If it's in that little purview area, I think you should be. Only that little spot. You're trying to grasp what I'm trying to tell you, right?
I'm lost now.
If they
actually.
come back and say, look, you didn't put the sidewalk piece in, we want you to put this little piece in to connect to the piece that we have now. All right, that's.
Okay, now I understand.
The state might just come in and just hook right to it the way they want. And
No,
then
actually, it's a very different intersection.
Yeah.
We're tying into the existing sidewalk coming off of the market,
Right, and they're probably gonna wipe all that out.
They're actually getting rid of that right lane
Yep.
and shifting it to the north. So basically, it's going to be, I think, I submitted the plan. I think it'd be 2 side-by-side cars with a right turn.
Right. No, I understand, but that alleviates any trouble. They get their money, we get a little thing that says, hey, if they come at you and say, you missed this little piece, please put it in.
I think there's a couple of complications there. One, the sidewalk that's in the front of your property, you know, adjacent to Route 28, that's 5 feet wide, right? What you built,
Yes,
okay. The state is now proposing that to be 7 feet because the bike lanes went from in the street to raised.
yeah.
So they need to go through, now that's an adjustment they did after the fact, because when we were first looking at this plan, it showed the bike lanes out in the street, and,
Yep.
and there was only a 5-foot wide sidewalk. So I think that's a complication. They're gonna have to do something with that bike lane all the way across. That's all in the state right of way. So I'm assuming that's gonna be part of their project.
They're gonna take out the existing sidewalk that they just put in.
Yeah, could be.
Could be.
The other thing
It's our
is,
state.
and I can understand where Dave's coming from. When I went out there and looked at this, until that adjustment to the north with the curbside there, there could be impacts to those, at least one of those trees. And I see with the adjustment that the state is proposing, there's a likelihood that they could save that second tree. If you put a sidewalk in now, you would wipe it out. And that's why it's probably good to postpone it until that whole realignment is resolved by the state's project.
I'm all for that.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to cover,
yeah.
Can I say a different story, though? I mean, that's the most traveled part of our sidewalk and pedestrian traffic in town, and it's not gonna have a sidewalk
Oh, it
for
will.
4 years?
Well,
I mean, that's my concern, is that, okay, it's temporary, it's gonna be away, but there is a 4-year period here now where that traffic and people walking are not gonna have a sidewalk. And that's a concern.
they can go up and through the parking lot, down the sidewalk that way.
Well, that's a good point. Is there some action that you can take, Dave, so that you would be putting in a temporary sidewalk, at least to put a connector in? It doesn't have to be the full 5-foot wide. And that would at least alleviate that whole issue, because I agree with you. I
Then
think
you're
there
getting
needs,
into American with Disabilities Act issues.
well, yeah, that's true, too.
Yep. So if the tree has to come out in order for any type of sidewalk
Any
to
side.
go in this area.
Yeah,
Yeah. And you see, the state's pushed the sidewalk, where we go, moving target here. So the state has pushed the sidewalk further to the north in the area where the tree is.
right.
So right now, we do have a sidewalk in front of a facility, but it doesn't go anywhere. It ends at, it's so, and I was surprised.
I mean, there is a connection that you could walk through the parking lot, through the connector that's between your property and the Village Market parking lot.
Yep.
And everybody's going to be walking through the parking lot anyway when they go from one end to the other. I mean, there is a means to do that without being in the roadway.
Yeah, the market sidewalk is right here,
Yeah,
and everybody I see that takes advantage of the intersection and the sidewalks just walks across the parking lot. And they don't use this. But, we'll do whatever the planning board wants. It's just, we're just trying to save the tree.
well, I'd like to hear from the other board members, because if we're going to insist on a sidewalk, we're losing a tree.
May I ask a
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So is there any configuration that ultimately the sidewalk can be built without losing the tree, and that's why you're waiting?
The-
But you just think it's better to wait so that you know exactly what needs to be done?
I think we can get 4 feet of sidewalk, but it would go right up against the tree. And the problem
right.
is, the tree is 1.5 to 2 feet in elevation higher than the street because of the
Right.
root ball. So
So
It-
what's the
it-
advantage in delaying? It just means we're going to keep the tree until the sidewalk is built.
no, I think, right now, if you look at, well, you don't have it, is our design plan. We're picking up the sidewalk here and going 5 feet and down this curb line.
And then ending it.
But,
Yeah.
but the tree is right here. And the state, go back to that plan, they're pushing the sidewalk way out here because they're getting rid of the right lane onto Queen Anne Road.
Okay, so does that mean that, I'm a little
The-
confused. Does that mean the tree will stay?
They show
Ultimately?
it going on their plan, but I don't see a reason for the tree to come out because they
So-
are moving the sidewalk
So
so far
then,
north.
so I don't understand what the issue is. It's just that we want some sort of sidewalk now before the ultimate.
Somebody can't walk along that roadway now because there's no sidewalk.
No sidewalk.
I see, yes, and so it's unsafe, yes.
Could I ask Christine to clarify something on this?
So
Go ahead.
we had, in looking at it, Queen Anne Road is also a scenic road, so that's kind of right at the start of that. So maybe that would have to go for a permit in order to have the removal. That would be the first thing I see. The second thing that I see is if you do some type of a letter, you got to make sure that it has an ending time on it or something like that, because we don't know when the state is going to actually do this. And I know that some of the things we've run across since I've been here is that there have been some planning board decisions that have been kind of open-ended, and it's been a problem. So make sure you put a time limit if you decide to move in that direction. And I don't know if that would have any teeth as far as, you know, if it's not in by such and such a date, that they have to put it in, and how the change of course would be, the cost of such a thing. So
Well,
all of those things.
unless you hold a portion of the bond. Frank, you have a question?
Yeah, let me, as I understand it, the state has not finalized its plan.
No.
Is that correct? Okay.
Correct.
So things could change. But we anticipate that the plan will be finished in 2 years or a year, or,
I think they're shooting for 2026 to go to bidding.
okay. So one possibility would be to reduce the bond.
Yeah.
Let's say from
Right.
50 to 10. And then let's see what happens with the state plan. I know that doesn't deal with the sidewalk issue, but at least it,
Well, that was my question, is that if the state doesn't do anything, would we require that the applicant is responsible for constructing some sort of sidewalk?
well, that's the point of keeping it 10.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I
Yeah.
know, but I'm asking that question, is that a legitimate course of action to take? That we'd be then putting the burden on the applicant to do that and withholding 5,000, 10,000 of the bond to fund that in case the state didn't do it.
And as, Mr. Chair, your point, I mean, I went and took a look at it as well, and
Yeah.
it's not ideal, but people can go through the driveway.
Right.
Avoid the road as a temporary.
State projects had this tendency to drag on. And if we elect a modification to the plan and maybe adjust those parking spots there so that the sidewalk comes down toward the inside of the parking lot rather than the outside, there may be a way to accomplish this with some readjustment. But again, the reason for a $10,000 bond, 2 years down the road, if nothing happens with the state, with their project, we could adjust this and close this out at that time. I would suggest we do something along those lines, but hold the bond until a portion of the bond, so that we can at least make a decision at that point. In a year from now, when the state comes forward with clear definition, the applicant can come and request a reduction if they.
David, is this on the tip,
Pardon me?
on the Transportation Improvement Program, the tip?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay.
I don't know the state's acronyms. It was very frustrating getting permit from them to do
No, I
all
know.
this work. They're
David,
not
the
user-friendly anymore.
the parking that people are cutting through is not part of the property that it's a completely separate property, or it's part of the same property?
Here,
Yeah, those
So-
parking spaces, because
those are our parking spaces on our
Those are
property.
your parking
Yeah.
spaces.
Yeah.
So if we made them a little shorter for compact cars and put a temporary sidewalk right there?
We'd have to take 4.5 feet out of the parking spaces, because the tree is right there.
Right
And
there, so it's not like there's room on the other side.
Yeah.
Right.
You could extend the parking
could put two on each
spaces
side of
a
it.
little bit further, because there's a lot of room in there to do that. 4 feet, you could still accommodate it. And then you could close the whole thing out if you wanted to.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna say, I really don't like the idea of having no parking, even if it was just a line through the parking lot that
Yeah.
said, this is where the parking lot, this is where our sidewalk is temporarily going.
So the question is that MassDOT right-of-way, or is that town right-of-way?
Right here is Town of Chatham.
That's town of Chatham?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So that's a little bit underneath our purview then.
Yeah.
I like your idea, Bob, is move the parking spaces down. They could be compact cars spaces and extend them a little bit and shift the curb down, put a 4-foot walk in there.
I can run that by the applicant,
Yeah.
but if it was me, I would just go ahead and put the sidewalk in as planned and take the tree out. I believe Attorney Riley did file with the town back in the spring for removal of that tree. So I think we could go to work tomorrow if we wanted to.
Was that approved when you filed?
I imagine it was, because I didn't see any correspondence otherwise.
The bylaw was just passed on that.
Right, and it's also, the planning board would have to hold a hearing.
I was gonna
If it's on a scenic road, if it's on Queen Anne's a scenic road, so the planning board would have had to have held a hearing, so I don't know.
Yeah, I
that
know
there's
he
a-
filed it, I think it was in May. So I assumed it was permitted at that point.
I'll check in with the tree warden.
I'll send you a copy of the application.
Okay,
Well, good thing I told him not to take the tree out, because
Could I,
be a lot of angry people
All
here
right,
then.
so what would the board like, how would they like to proceed on this?
Wait a minute, I have one more thing. I think if you wanted to take and shorten the parking spaces up for smaller cars, that I would think just a regular asphalt sidewalk, bare minimum, with no curbing on it or anything like that.
Yeah.
IDA, of course, but instead of putting all the massive curbing and putting concrete and all that stuff in there, I think that we could probably get by with a lesser quality sidewalk for the time being. Would that be?
Well, I think there needs to be a connector, and
Oh, yeah,
that-
but.
this is an avenue to accomplish it, is with those adjustment in those spaces. I would put the burden back on the applicant's engineer to come up with an adjustment there. Hold so much money, and we can review and process this as a second go-round.
so am I correct in understanding we were proposing a temporary adjustment to the plans, and we'll withhold some of the bond to build those adjustments that leaves the tree in place, but that the ultimate solution will be, we understand by 2026 that MassDOT will come up with a better
Yep.
solution. And then what will be the situation with the temporary solution that we've put in? Would it just be simply redundant and unnecessary, or would it need to be changed?
Well, if it's
again?
asphalt, it can come out pretty
I
easily.
would
It
think
could
that
come
the
out,
parking
okay.
lot that's there, you could incorporate the
Yeah.
parking, the asphalt that's already there, so, without disturbing the parking area.
Right.
Maybe put a couple, wheel stops there.
Yeah, you could just reconfigure it.
Right.
Yep.
And then
You
so
could just
people,
reconfigure it.
Draw the line.
but
So My question would be, so how much money will this temporary configuration that leaves the tree in place, how much can we anticipate that that would cost that we would withhold the bond? 5,000, 10,000, 2,000?
Well, he's gonna put that temporary in now, but you're still gonna have to hold some money back in case the state has
Yep.
other ideas. I would hold 10,000 back
Okay.
Okay,
and come back. If the state hasn't a plan that this is the plan or something, then maybe you could come back and say, look, they're not gonna do this, they're gonna do it outside my purview.
I think Christie's suggestion that within 5 years, or something like, 5 years, we have to give them their money back.
Well, that's fine, I would make it, I would think a little shorter. I think that they want to get this intersection done, and as you said, that 27 was a bid date.
Okay.
So by 28, they should be constructing it.
All right, so we want to
Oh,
consider releasing a portion of the bond, $40,000 of the bond, holding 10,000.
Yeah, yes.
And asking for a temporary sidewalk that would connect between here and the adjacent property. Okay.
yes, and leaving the tree in.
And leaving a tree.
And do we want to define a date that we,
I don't think we need to.
I don't think we need
I
to.
don't think we
because-
need to. It
Yeah,
was
we'll
more
have
just
a
for a
bond.
letter.
okay, great,
In
great.
that case, so move.
Well, Warren,
I'll
you,
withdraw my so move. Warren.
Yeah, Bob, this Warren. Question for you. Is it necessary for a temporary sidewalk that probably wouldn't ever be ADA compliant anyway? Is it necessary that it be asphalt? Could it just be compacted gravel?
No, it has to be asphalt.
It's already
Yeah.
laid, right?
It's a walking path. It's not it's not a sidewalk, but
Right, but it still has to be, it's asphalted for, you have to have it for a wheelchair,
yeah.
which the ADA is only the slopes down to get onto it and then down.
Okay,
I'm sure
then I-
that,
too many
I don't
All right.
see too many
Charlene?
wheelchairs.
I would so move what the chair previously stated as a proposed motion.
And do I have a second?
I'll second.
Can
All right.
Can I,
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, can I just
clarification?
clarify? Yes, so we're releasing the bond, but we're not issuing a certificate of compliance because.
No, we're leasing 40,000.
40,000 of the
Right.
bond, leaving, and then when the applicant comes back in to release the additional 10,000,
Right.
a certificate of compliance would be issued at that point in time.
Is the non-issuance of the certificate of compliance going to be an issue for the occupancy permit?
No, Chatham doesn't tie it
Okay,
to an
perfect.
occupancy.
All right, that's good.
Never mind then.
Okay. All right, then we'll do a roll call vote. Catherine Halpern,
I approve.
Warren Chain,
Warren Chain approve.
Ward Shafter,
Bob Orchard, approve.
Charlene Greenhall,
Charlene Greenhalgh, approve.
Frank Shear,
I approve.
and Bob Tubus,
Bob Dubus, approve.
and Art Sprue, I approve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next, we have an approval not required, 727 Main Street. Someone from the applicant or Ryder and Wilcox?
Good evening, Dave. Good evening, David Little. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm representing Janet Whittemore, who's sitting in the audience right now. This plan that's before you is essentially the same plan that you approved back in 2020, with the exception of the fact that we've altered the interior lot line between what was Lot 1 and Lot 2. It's now Lot 1A and Lot 2A. The remaining Lot 2A does comply with zoning with respect to frontage and area requirements, and Lot 1A became a little bit larger. So it's a very simple change, and we would request endorsement.
Any questions from the board on this application? All right, seeing none, then we need to make a motion to endorse the A&R plan for the division of land situated in Chatham. Prepared.
Also move.
Okay,
Second, I second the motion.
all right, we'll take a roll call vote. Catherine Halpern.
Yes, I endorse.
Warren Chain, I endorse too.
Bob Wershafter.
Bob Wirtschafter endorses.
Charlene Greenhall.
Charlene Greenhalgh, endorse.
Frank Shear.
Frank Scherer, endorse.
Bob Dubus.
Bob Duba's going to abstain.
Okay, and Art Spru. I'll approve the endorsement. Right here.
Planning board members will sign it after the meeting.
Did our signatures get recorded with the registry?
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so next, we have the West Chatham Neighborhood Center discussion. It's a presentation by Union Studios. Jeremy Lake is going to provide a presentation on the missing middle. We haven't seen this presentation, or we may have seen portions of it, but hopefully you can clarify this with us. And then afterwards, we can continue our discussion from the workshop at 4 o'clock.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. So my name's Jeremy Lake with Union Studio Architecture and Community Design. And we were asked to come tonight to kind of share with you guys a bit of a synopsis of an effort we did a couple years ago with the Cape Cod Commission, which was called Community Resiliency by Design. So we think it'll be very informative relative to the things that you guys are considering out at West Chatham. And it's setting the stage for an effort we're going to help you with there as well, doing a couple of visualizations so you guys can really see the sort of impacts or how things are playing out. So let me tab through this. A little bit about Union. We were founded in 2001. We are architects and community designers. Our primary office is in Providence, Rhode Island, but we also have a secondary office down in Philadelphia. We are anywhere between 36 and 38 employees. I always lose track, but I think we keep growing by 1 or 2 people every couple months, which is really exciting and great. And our mission is to use the power of design to enrich lives and strengthen communities. We have a pretty broad portfolio of the types of work that we do. We do everything from residential. I would say housing kind of is our main thing, but we do residential at all scales. We do, large-scale multifamily buildings, small-scale cottages, single-family, student housing, market-rate housing. A third of our portfolio is affordable housing. As I mentioned, we're community designers. That's really my primary role in the firm. But we've also done some office buildings, we've done some hotels, some boutique kind of spaces. So we do kind of a wide range of things, but like I said, sort of housing is sort of our sweet spot. And even though we are based in Providence, I will say we also have a growing portfolio of work out on the Cape. We do a lot of work out here. We love working out on the Cape. Here are some examples of projects we've done out here. Upper left, Heritage Sands is a cottage community down in Dennisport. Upper right and the lower middle, Brewster Landing and Maritime Landing. Those are a pair of 40B projects we did recently, so primarily market rate with a few affordable housing. Lower right, Sea Captain's Row and Hyannis are relatively recently completed. The building you see there could have anywhere between 6 to 12 units in it, and there's a series of those there. Lower left is a revitalization effort in Hyannis, 255 Main Street, that converted this old office building into a sort of mixed-use retail with residential above. Upper middle forward at the Rock, that's supportive housing for adults with autism, independent living. And the rendering there is something that we're working on currently at Mashpee Commons, extending the town center now with their first real big phase of residential. There's a limited bit of residential at Mashpee. We're really excited to be helping bring a true mixed-use vibe to Mashpee Commons. But tonight we wanted to talk to you guys about community resiliency by design. This is an effort we undertook in 2018 and 2019 with the Cape Cod Commission. They approached us because they had just completed a pair of studies. On the left, the Regional Housing Market Analysis 10-year forecast. This was published in 2017, but the data in it was 2015 data. They were forecasting what was going to be happening with housing supply and demand over 10 years, so into 2025. And following right on the heels of that, they did their Cape Cod Regional Policy Plan, which obviously housing was a big component of that, amongst many other things. And what they found in these, what these reports really highlighted were a number of challenges relative to housing supply and demand. Obviously, the Cape population was intended to grow over that 10-year period. They expected growth of an additional 6,200 full-time residents. And the chart on the right, I think, is really telling. I know the colors are a little bit odd, but that the yellow bar at the bottom is how much renter incomes were increasing year by year, which is, let's say, by 1%. Bump up to the orange line, the rents that those renters would be looking at are increasing year by 4%. Big gap there, ever getting worse. similar with the orange text, you can see owner income increasing 2% a year, but the housing costs increasing 5% a year. So the problems that everyone is feeling are almost getting worse and worse and worse every year. That's why we're trying to solve some of these issues, right? They also notice other underlying challenges and things in the statistics behind it. I think it's very interesting to note that Cape Cod's housing stock is 82% single-family detached homes. The national average is 62%, Massachusetts, elsewhere, 52%. So the overwhelming majority of housing is single-family homes. That's great if you're a family that needs a 3-4 bedroom house. But as we all know, that's actually a small percentage of the number of households that are out there. There's a lot of singles, couples, roommates, families that are only, 2 parents and a child. So there's a sort of mismatch, if you will, between the housing that's available and the actual need that's out there. And the chart along the bottom, again, this was from those reports, comparing from 2015 to 2025, sort of the increasing delta between what was considered an affordable home price and what the median home price were. And I highlight there, I don't know if it's, usually we're number one is a good thing, but here I don't think it's so great that Chatham was showing sort of the biggest gaps in terms of what the median house price was versus what an affordable home price would be. So it's a challenge all over the Cape. At the same time that the Cape Cod Commission was doing these reports, obviously the communities on the Cape were well aware of this, and we're trying to start to address these things. So updating housing production plans, doing a number of their own studies, identifying areas where maybe they wanted to either revise their zoning codes, create new policies, investments in infrastructure were ongoing. So this was an active conversation. It wasn't just the Cape Cod Commission that was recognizing this as a need or something that was wanting to be addressed. So where we got involved was the Cape Cod Commission approached us and said, we really want you to host a series of community conversations about how we could meet the increasing demand for housing, but do it with some community input and try to find ways where people would feel like it was enhancing their existing communities, not something that was sort of running counter to the existing character that people really enjoyed about the places that they currently live. So really this effort occurred in 5 communities across the Cape. There were 3 initially, which were Falmouth, Eastham, and Orleans that we worked with. Later, Hyannis and Sandwich also had us come out and do something similar. In the end, though, between those 5 towns where we had first and second presentations, we also ended up presenting at the One Cape Summit, both in 2018 and 2019, and the Cape Housing Institute also had a series of workshops. So over the course of a year and a half, we were actually out here having this conversation with a lot of communities, which was really great, really exciting, and now we're really excited to be out here talking to you guys about this. I joked for a while I was going to make like a concert tour shirt of like all the places we've been. So this feels like maybe we're kicking off the reunion tour, which is really exciting. So in each of the 5 communities that we worked, again, the idea here wasn't that let's just throw increased density, everywhere. In every place, they had identified places where they thought that was logical. In Eastham, Orleans, and Falmouth, in all 3 of those places, it was essentially places that were almost like a commercial core. And the Cape has a lot of conditions where you have fairly intense commercial uses, and then almost immediately abutting it as single-family residential. There's no real transition. Typically you would expect a little bit of a transition between those sorts of things. And that's rare to actually find out on the Cape, and that was the condition in those 3 towns where we were doing our exercise. When Hyannis came on board, it was a slightly different condition. It was the east end of town, that's the hospital down in the lower right-hand corner. They were doing a series of infrastructure sewer improvements that they thought was going to spur additional opportunity for residential infill. And so it was a different sort of set of challenges or underlying opportunities that they wanted us to kind of look at. And then similarly in Sandwich, it was down in South Sandwich, they were going to, again, be extending the sewer. And so there were going to be, again, the potential for some new opportunities for additional housing. And the question was, what should we be doing about that? How should we be taking advantage of that? So again, similar conditions in the sense that it was either existing conditions that felt a little out of whack or new infrastructure that was coming into place that suggested these were probably areas we really should focus on and try to better understand. So when we went out into the community, we would have 2 meetings, and in the first meeting we would set the stage. So everything I just talked about a minute ago, the challenges of the supply and demand issues, we made sure that the public that were there were understanding of that. I think everybody was already feeling the pressure, there was a housing crisis brewing, but it was really helpful to kind of share some of those statistics so they understood what was behind all of it. And the big scary thing that we started to talk about was density, right? You throw that word out and everybody kind of loses their mind. It's a scary proposition, but our job was to kind of talk people back off the ledge. Let's kind of get a handle on this. It's going to be okay. So first and foremost, we wanted to relay, density is simply a mathematical calculation. It's kind of, I won't say arbitrary, but it can take many different forms. So this is an example of a project that we have. That lower right-hand corner, that's in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, which is where I live. The cottage is on green. On the left-hand side is what the zoning required or allowed. So it's hard to tell from this image, but to the left is the main street of East Greenwich. Right behind it is single family. Again, that kind of common condition. And this one lot was zoned as multifamily, up to 20 units per acre, had all the kind of buffers and setbacks and things that you would expect to find in a zoning code. But what the resulting structure would have been was nothing that anybody in the community actually wanted to see put there. On the right is what we actually proposed. So by basically ignoring everything that was in the zoning code, we simply said we could do the same number of units, but maybe concentrate the open space as something meaningful in the middle instead of stuff around the edge. It became a cottage court, same number of units, that's 15 units on 3/4 of an acre. So that's 20 units to the acre, but in a form that the community suddenly got excited about. And the community was, when we said, we're ignoring all of your zoning rules, the neighbors were going, great, thank you. We appreciate that, because we recognized that there was a form where that was more appropriate. So the other idea behind a lot of this is this what some people have dubbed the missing middle. There's these series of housing types that were common pre-World War II that we sort of stopped using a lot of after World War II. And a lot of that had to do with the way that we wrote our zoning codes that became more popular following World War II. We kind of really made everything black and white. You're either single family at like a unit per acre, or you're multifamily at 20 units to an acre. And we didn't have this sort of fine grain of stuff in between that had been really helpful previously for sort of addressing a wide variety of housing types. So the idea here is let's sort of reappropriate these things and reutilize these. And really what this scale shows, everything from accessory dwelling units, cottage courts, duplexes, townhouses, those are all effectively single-family homes that are either attached or configured in a compact setting. The ones to the right of the line are what we're calling stacked flats. That maybe in Providence we have a lot of what are called triple deckers. So it's 3 units stacked on top of each other. The middle one there, a manor house. Think of that as like a captain's house, like a large single-family home that maybe has 4 to 6 units inside of it, all the way up to a walk-up, which is at its most 12 units, and there's a building code provision where you can have a single shared stair, 4 units per floor, up to 3 floors. So this kind of logic of a 12-unit cap on what that would be. Once you get beyond that, you kind of jump into what you more typically would think of as multifamily. But again, all of these types used to be available to us, and they're things that we think make sense. A lot of the examples of work I've shown you so far from our own portfolio fall somewhere in the spectrum. So the next thing we tried to do with the community is we did this sort of exercise to help them agree that it is kind of hard to tell what the underlying numerical density is. So we would put up 2 images, like these 2 images, and say which one has a higher density. So I'm going to ask you guys to sort of show of hands. Which one of you thinks that the image on the right has the higher density versus the one on the left? So one on the right, show of hands, nobody. One on the left, it's a little bit mixed. Most people are going on the left. And that is in fact correct. So the one on the left is a duplex, and it's on 0.12 acres, so that would be 16 units to an acre in terms of density. Whereas on the right, we were saying this is kind of your bread and butter single-family home from the kind of communities we were working in on the, around the Cape, where you usually have, a quarter-acre, half-acre lots, that's 2 to 4 units to an acre. But the point was, if these 2 houses were neighbors, you wouldn't suddenly expect that one was, 4 times the density of its neighbor, right? So the forms felt correct. It was the underlying metrics of the number of units, the amount of land that was somehow different. So we did this again with a couple other ones, and I won't make you guys raise your hands on all of them, but you can think about it on your own as we go through. On the right, we had a much bigger structure, but still at the end of the day, the math actually works out fairly similarly. So, and these are all examples from the Cape, by the way. So the one on the right, that's a structure that has 5 units in it on, a quarter of an acre, so it's around 18 units to an acre. And again, the duplex we were looking at a second ago. Showed another example. In this case, we were just trying to point out, and technically both of these are what we would call a manor house, so, somewhere like 3 to 6 units in a single little structure. The one on the left is half the density of the one on the right, even though they're both the same building type. And then this last example, which was one of my favorites, they're the same. So, it can be deceiving, but the ones on the right, which are these small little stacked flats, those are 2 units in those 2 little, structures. It ends up working out to 20 units to the acre, which is comparable to, an apartment building that we would expect to be 20 units to the acre. So again, looks can be deceiving, and in the end, that's really what you're worried about is the form of these things and whether or not they feel like they fit in. The density underlying it is important to understand, but you can't always judge a book by that initial calculation. So what we would then go through is we would go through the various types that we were identifying as potential candidates for being used on the Cape. So cottages, townhouses, duplexes, manor houses. And we tried to sort of gauge in those independent communities if we could find examples and sort of tune what we were talking about in terms of densities around those. So this is just an example. The cottages, So in the lower left, we found a bunch of cottages that were in Sandwich. In the upper right, that's a cottage community that's in Dennisport, and you do the math, it works out to 15 units to an acre. In the lower right, we would then put up some images and say, okay, but the character of it is important too. So which one of these feels more appropriate? And we just had some good conversations with whomever was there with the community. And we did that for each of the 6 types that we were talking about. So cottages, duplexes, townhouses, the stacked flats, the manor houses, and the walk-ups. And we sort of would go through those and at the end say, you know, which of these feel appropriate, which of these don't feel appropriate. And generally people were pretty supportive once you went through that of understanding any of them could be if they were built the correct way. I think it was also important to highlight, and I know that'll be important where we're talking about here in West Chatham as well, is that these same types can be mixed use. So it could still be a manor house, but it might be that some of the ground floor is actually utilized as retail. And we're all familiar with structures like the one on the right-hand side there that, you know, Main Street anywhere USA, probably over time was shops, might have been offices upstairs, could be residential. So really the use is less important than the form, right? The form is what makes it feel like it belongs. And, you know, so as long as there's not a taxidermist in there or something, right, the uses are probably less important to worry about. All right, so following the first meetings, we then would put an online visual preference survey that folks would answer for us. And we really tried to have this focus in on 2 issues, which were style and scale, because we were tasked with basically creating some prototypes for those building types that would be appropriate. So on the left, we said, you know, do you think a building of this style would be a good fit within the study area? And folks would just see one of these images at a time without any real context and just make a judgment call one by one. And the way we organized the images we put in there is we had examples that were single family, that were townhouses, that were some small multifamily buildings. And we had them on a spectrum from sort of most traditional to most contemporary. And people would give us an answer of yes, no, maybe, as to whether or not they thought it would fit. Did the same thing with scale, single family, townhouse, multifamily examples, but we'd go from 1, 1.5 to 2.5, 3.5 stories. Again, just to see what people were generally thinking could be appropriate for those varying towns, for those varying contexts. So folks would be responding for their own community, if you will. And what was great is because we used these same images with all 5 communities, we could actually start to sort of compare a bit too, which was really useful. So for instance, on the upper right there, when we showed a single story cottage and said, do you think a building of this scale will be a good fit? Again, within the study area, not the sort of broader Falmouth, but in that little Davis Straits area of Falmouth. And what was interesting to see in a place like Falmouth, most people kind of said, no, this isn't a good fit. I think you're kind of underdoing it here. You're not taking advantage of where this is in the site. Whereas places like Eastham were much more supportive of, no, that feels appropriate, even though it's meant to be our sort of town center. We're much more comfortable with something of that scale. Story and a half was sort of universally understood as feeling pretty appropriate. And again, as you found your way up the scale, you lower image there that was meant to be like a 2.5 story townhouse. You know, it could still be a pretty good fit. Falmouth, Orleans weren't too worried about that sort of scale, but when we got to Eastham or Hyannis or Sandwich, generally folks were saying maybe not so much. But I also think it's worth saying, like in all of these, right, there's a spectrum. So some folks were happy with any of these scales in the study area. But again, we were looking for some of those underlying trends. Same thing with style. Generally speaking, I've been kind of jokingly referring to the most traditional, let's call that Pottery Barn. You know, the next one was more like Crate and Barrel. Crate and Barrel was pretty popular across the board. When we got into a little bit West Elm, people were kind of okay with it, but when you got to the really, really contemporary stuff, nobody really felt like that was the most appropriate thing. So again, we went back and we compared those. Again, those were just the single family examples, but we looked at the townhouses, we looked at the multifamily. And again, the sense we got was that things generally in the 1.5 to the 2.5 story range, people were comfortable with in these study areas. Eastham was a little bit lower, 1 to 2 stories. Similarly with style, people tended to like the traditional buildings with simple detailing that felt sort of the most appropriate for the Cape and were least receptive to the very contemporary buildings. And if there was anywhere that they were okay with something a little more contemporary, it was actually Eastham, which was interesting. Let's see. So when we came back for the second meeting, these were the kind of, we call these the sugar cubes, the kind of just trying to describe a unit within each of these buildings so you could understand the types. But the second meeting, based on that input, we came back and said, so this is what some of those could really look like, trying to take into consideration what we heard in terms of the style, trying to take into consideration things we heard about with the scale as well. So whereas on the previous slide, if I go back, you know, we may have been suggesting some of these might be 3 stories or 1 story. Based on what we were hearing folks saying, you know, really thinking of things being in the 1.5 to 2, at most 2.5 stories, but 2.5 was okay, not 3. But, you know, doing that upper floor within a set of dormers makes it feel like it's appropriate and fits within the context in most of the places we were talking to. So again, for each of these, we went back through and tried to share, okay, so here's an example of a stacked duplex or a double decker. Again, what does that mean? The yield is probably somewhere in the 10 to 15 units to an acre. How does that work? So in this case, the blue showing that there might be a single story unit on the ground floor, but there was a stair that would take you up to a 2-story, think of almost like a townhouse on top of a flat. And that's how there's 2 units in this building, each with their own door, in a building that feels like it could fit pretty nicely, at least adjacent to a single family neighborhood. And also just making sure that it was also clear that, you know, it could be a little bit style agnostic too. So you could do 2 stories or 3 stories, a little more traditional, a little more contemporary. You could actually combine these into a run of things. So maybe you make it into a 6-unit building that's really a series of these attached. So again, it doesn't mean it has to be a carbon copy of the one that we did as the sort of prototype. But again, hopefully there's a version of it that would resonate with folks and they would think feels appropriate. We then would follow up with a couple of illustrative case studies, and this is, I think, what we're basically planning on doing with you all as well, with a couple of sites that you have in mind. So in Falmouth, there was a parcel that was on the Davis Straits area. There was a Staples here currently, I think it is. But again, you can see this like commercial use immediately to single-family adjacencies. And so we tried to show how you could build out a corner of this using a number of those different types and transitioning from the bigger ones, you know, the 12-unit walk-ups that might be mixed use when they're up on Main Street or up on that commercial parking plaza, but then transition back maybe to some manor houses, townhouses, duplexes as a means of then stepping back down towards the single-family neighbors that already exist just beyond, and what that could sort of yield in terms of a place and number of units and how it would park and all those things. So trying to make it sort of real, if you will. Eastham, a similar challenge right up on their main road with single family just behind. So a similar idea of a transition. But again, remember, Eastham didn't feel comfortable in the 2.5, 3-story range. So we capped ourselves at 2 stories and said, what would the impact of that be in terms of how many units we might be able to get to fit out here? And then last but not least, again, with the first 3 Orleans, this was the Governor Prince Inn's parcel. So again, now showing it using some of the lower end of the spectrum types that we had talked about. So we snuck a few little cottage courts in the corners. Out to a mixed-use building out on the main drag. And what was nice about this collection was between the 3, we were illustrating how a combination of these types was yielding anywhere from 10 units to an acre in Orleans up to 20 units to an acre in Falmouth. So people could also kind of begin to visualize what the impact of the trade-off of that number is, which I know is exactly what you guys are debating these days for West Chatham. One thing I did want to quickly share, what's kind of exciting, is all 3 of these have moved forward in their own ways. So in Falmouth, they are working on a form-based code for that area that was sort of motivated and driven by some of the things we were talking about there. In Eastham, we were excited to be part of a team that came up with a master plan vision for not only the parcel we were looking at, but also the Tea Time parcel and their senior center to look at ways of including additional housing and mixed use on those parcels. And they're now working currently on a form-based code for that area. And in the town of Orleans, that Governor Prince site, we went from working with the Cape Cod Commission on these case studies to working with the town, helping craft a vision that was the basis of an RFP, to now being a part of the team that actually won the RFP to move it forward. So it's actually been kind of fun to be a part of that project, and it'll hopefully be, you know, come to fruition and be a real thing before we know it, which would be really great. Quickly on the other 2 communities, Hannah's, again, a very different set of conditions here. We did show the option for things like in the lower left, similar ideas of redeveloping underutilized properties with something wholly new in those areas. The upper left, retrofitting existing structures. That's the 255 Main Street example I showed earlier, where again, that was a building that was really only used for commercial uses, but adapting it into a mixed use with residential. We showed this idea of infilling underutilized lots. There were empty parcels or big parking lots that had more parking than they needed. There's an opportunity to put a little bit of housing on those and actually to hold up the sort of street edges that everybody's trying to create. And also a strategy we hadn't talked about previously in the other communities was the idea of adding accessory dwelling units. So there's a lot of buildings out there currently that have small outbuildings. They might be a garage or something else. We did find some examples of accessory dwelling units out there. That's another viable strategy for adding additional housing, especially in this sort of infill lot by lot sort of basis way. And then finally in South Sandwich, this was a town-owned parcel, so a big chunk of land that they had some recreational space on that was now going to be serviced by sewer and infrastructure. So again, a similar exercise on an even bigger scale of saying, if you created a new community here with a series of streets and blocks and sort of working that same transition of maybe the lower scale types out at the edges and getting increasingly denser as you find your way up towards Quaker Lane, where you could have some mixed use, the yields of, 5 to 10 units at the edge, 10 to 15 in the middle, 15 to 20 as you're getting more towards the core. Really what this was meant to illustrate was that resulting neighborhood could be as many as 440 units. The existing underlying zoning that allows for 1.5 units per acre would only yield 63 units on that same parcel. So it's not to say 440 is the appropriate answer, but simply that this is the opportunity. If we're trying to solve for a housing crisis, if you start to deploy these types, you could find what is that comfortable number, but you can certainly start to bridge the gap in ways that we think are useful, meaningful, and appropriate. All right, so West Chatham visualizations. So what we've been asked to do is basically to take a similar approach here where, building on those studies and efforts we had done, let's do a few test fits and visualizations for a couple of the parcels out here based on the form-based code that you guys are currently working on and reviewing. So this is the West Chatham Neighborhood Center District, at least as I've last seen it from a draft that was dated 10/23/23. And so far, these were the 3 sites that were identified as potential candidates to look at. So we said we could do 3 parcels, thinking maybe it would show a couple of different conditions. Or like we did with the earlier studies, we could have one maybe be a little bit more of the denser types, one maybe be a little bit more of the less dense types. But these are the 3 parcels in question. I'll jump ahead to this slide so you can maybe get a better sense of what each of those are. 1671 is the parcel that's a little mixed use sort of plaza. I think there's the post office is in that particular one. 1652 is across the street. That's the art gallery, but it actually has a whole lot of land behind it. And then over at the second circle there, 1589 Main Street, again, another little sort of retail strip. I think that one has the liquor store in it. But again, the thought was these are a couple parcels that are anywhere from sort of 2 to 3 acres where we could begin to look at how what you guys are considering for your form-based code would play out, what it would look like, how, what an illustrative plan could be, what that might then look like if we did a little 3D visualization as well. Not to say that that's what will be built there, much like the examples I showed before, Governor Prince evolved over time as it became real and people were doing the effort. But that's really what we are talking about and considering here today. So happy to answer any questions you have, any thoughts or input you guys have about this exercise. We literally just signed the proposal last week, so we're getting ready to gear up for it. We're going to have continued conversations with these guys to do what we need to do with it. But again, wanted to share both that background with you, hopefully it illustrates some of the things I know you guys are thinking through and considering, and any thoughts you guys might have about this before we jump into it.
Well, what I just want to make the board aware of is we, right now, have not defined what is it that we're going to be heading, what direction are we heading in. I know it was in the draft, but we are doing a little bit of reassessment of that. What is it that we would like these visualizations to be? If you change from one density to another, the character and everything that Union Studios is going to represent is going to show something different. So we need to provide some guidance to them. Maybe there is a fashion where we could show a different density for one or the other, but not both on the same site, but give a character of it. I'm open for any of your input, though. Catherine, you want to start?
Yeah, a couple comments. I think what Art said is very important. We're looking at some possible revisions to the bylaw. Also, there are more recent drafts than October 2023. I'm sure you know that the form-based code that we included in the bylaw was based on over a year of work with Cape Cod Commission to integrate that form-based code into the bylaw. And it did include very detailed consideration. Should we have 2 stories? Should we have 2.5 stories? And it did include response from the community. At every juncture, a survey was sent out to the community. Our comprehensive plan does ask that the ultimate zoning in the West Chatham Neighborhood Center be determined by the residents and stakeholders in that neighborhood center. So, of course, we gave extra weight to the community response from West Chatham residents. Just a little background, you may know all of this, and please forgive me if I'm repeating it. So I think the form-based code that we've got in the bylaw was carefully considered and reviewed. Also, I'd like to be sure that you look at our historic business district design guidelines, which were formally adopted by the planning board a few years ago as our design guidelines, and which do pertain to the West Chatham Neighborhood Center. So every project that will be built in the West Chatham Neighborhood Center would include the form-based code as defined in the draft bylaw, as well as the HBDC design guidelines. So we'd love for you to look at that. And as you also noticed in the bylaw, there are different zones, and there are different parameters for each zone. There's the A zone and then a couple of B zones. We do want to have mixed-use commercial, especially in the A zone and along Route 28, but I think we do want to see mixed use throughout the West Chatham Neighborhood Center. So those were some points I was very interested in. This is a personal opinion, I'd like to express it, in your work on a master plan vision, because I think especially meeting the housing crisis in Chatham, an issue that came up even in our discussion tonight, is we do need to think of the whole town, and we do need to look for areas in the whole town that can accommodate some greater residential density. And we need to plan for that in terms of infrastructure. But I do think taking a broader look at the whole town, not just the neighborhood centers, not just West Chatham Neighborhood Center, but in terms of housing, a variety of housing options, as we say, diversity of housing options, including affordable, attainable. It would be good if we can take a broader view, and I would love to see perhaps a master plan vision for the whole town about opportunities for creating more options for housing. One thing that we also have been discussing as a board is, as you brought up, the kind of transition zones to the east of the West Chatham Neighborhood Center in particular, that would be a good opportunity to create some increased residential density, but we would omit the commercial piece there, and it would be a transition zone to the R20 zoning that is the rest of Route 28. So that's something we want to keep in mind too. Other than that, I did have a question, sorry if I'm taking too much time, but in one of your slides, you mentioned, I think it was in Greenwich, that you ignored the zoning and you created that nice courtyard.
Yep.
So we'd like to, I think, I speak for, we would like to see things that look more like that nice courtyard thing and less like the one on the left. And I just wondered if you could share with us what you meant by saying you ignored the zoning.
Right, so we
Yeah.
went and sought a whole bunch of waivers to try to do it the way that we thought made more
Yes.
sense.
Why did you need those waivers? Because we would, I think, I would want to hear from the whole board on this. We
Yeah.
prefer the one
Yeah.
on the right.
Yeah, and that's why I think, I'm sure your form-based code is much closer to the one on the right than the one on the
Okay.
left. The one on the left would have been the zoning that had been in place in East Greenwich for 40, 50 years,
Okay.
So I think it highlights the underlying challenge a lot of times of the dumb old zoning,
Yeah.
right? And the form-based codes are trying to tackle a lot of these issues. So
Yeah.
that would be the hope, right? And
Yeah.
that's what we'll be looking at, can we create something that's, what can we create using the form-based code? Or one of the things we said we would do is if we see an obvious miss, is there something in there where like, this was not your intended outcome, but because you said
Yeah.
6%, not 16%, we did this, or, so.
I think we'd like to hear that feedback.
Yeah.
One thing that happened, at least some board members, when we saw the build-out analysis that was done for us for maximum build-out, they did do maximum residential build-out, and it doesn't actually fit the vision, I think, of what we were looking for when we generated the form-based code. So,
And that's always tricky, because,
Yeah.
it's almost like you want to be focused on the minimum build-out. Like, what is it we want to
Yes.
make sure we achieve?
yes.
Because I can see why it's scary if you said, if everybody applied this to its fullest extent and somehow Matt miraculously did it in the next 5 years, this wouldn't be anything that we would recognize, right?
Exactly,
So it's
yes.
kind of, it is a challenging thing to kind of come to grips with. Not everybody's going to do it, B, it's gonna take a long time, you know, C, it's moving us in the direction we wanna go. But how you come to grips with that is
Yeah.
ultimately a
But
challenge.
we'd like your feedback because
Yeah.
what we would like to see maximum aesthetic. What we want to see in the visuals from you is the maximum aesthetic production.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we did have a discussion on a couple of points that might affect your visuals at the 4 o'clock. We talked about increasing the depth of the A1 zone. Currently, it was set at 100 feet, and I'm not sure what the board's leaning toward, whether it's 150, 200, whatever. But the other thing that we are leaning toward in that first zone there, at least there, we would have something like a 50% commercial and 50% residential. We haven't really locked in that the Zone B, which is to the rear of that, it could be all residential, but it could still be a mix. So that all works into whatever density that we sort of give you guidance on all of this. But I think we're leaning toward a little bit deeper, about 50% for commercial in that first zone, and then whatever the board would like to see associated with visuals as far as the density is concerned. And maybe we do one with one density and one of the other parcels with another density, and just to get an idea. Just something to think about. Warren, would you like to ask?
Yes, thank you very much. Got a sense of deja vu. I think, I go back 2.5 years and we were looking at the same issues you have very specifically outlined. And where we are to now is we've gone through form-based code, we've come up with multiple drafts, and we have a draft which is newer than the ones you've seen.
Yeah.
And there's general agreement here that we're in the right ballpark. Encourage you to make sure you've got the most recent draft.
Oh, of course.
As mentioned, we, as a result of the build-out analysis that came up, which intended to maximize the number of housing units. It has never been the position of this board that we're trying to maximize the number of housing units in the West Chatham Neighborhood Center. Quite the contrary. Our principal objective is to create a neighborhood center where you can walk to most of the things you might need. It's going to be mixed use, multifamily, also addressing to some extent affordable attainable housing, but much more importantly, trying to just create higher density and therefore presumably slightly lower cost housing units. I would again encourage you to make sure you've got a copy of the Historic Business District design guidelines, because those really do affect the ultimate of what it needs to look like.
Yeah.
The draft that we have really talks about a lot about form in terms of height, in terms of roof lines, in terms of setbacks and so on. And combined, they really do, I think, for each of us, give a rough idea of what we think it's going to look like. I was really taken by the densities that you have presented out there. Every density that I heard you mention is 2 or 3 times, if not more, of the highest density that we are wrestling with here. Our eyes are glazing over when we talk about 12 units per acre. Maybe we can't do that. It's much too dense. Well, I think there's a lot to be said for the way we present this in terms of how you define what density is. Because I was taken by what you showed as something that didn't look particularly dense, but calculates out if you do it on a small quarter-acre lot and factor it up to an acre, it's a very high density. Well, I was taken by that in particular, that, whether we seem to be zeroing in on somewhere between 8 and 12 units per acre. We are wrestling with what percentage of that Zone A needs to be commercial. The built-out analysis maximized the housing and indicated that they thought there would be not much interest in the commercial area for reasons I'm not sure I understood. But at any rate, they had a lot of housing in the Zone A, which I would think would be very attractive for second-story offices for accountants and designers and whatever. But at any rate, we're not what's important for me is that you understand we're not trying to maximize the housing units here. We're not trying to create an affordable housing development. What we're looking for is a mixture of all of that together. There's a 40B development just to the east, and there's one to the west. It would probably be helpful for you to take a look at what is being thrown out there in terms of what they think those might look like, because they're going to be presumably in or close to the transition areas that we have yet to actually focus on, because we're trying to get the center done before we worry about the transition areas from the center. But it does seem to me that you are going to be able to come up with visual representations of what the areas you've picked as being perfectly acceptable areas to pick as to what it's going to look like. And what it's going to look like if you have a density of 8 or 12 under all of the same criteria that are in the draft as we currently have it. I can't imagine anything being deemed to be allowed to be higher or dramatically larger. Where the only thing we've ruled out so far is single-family homes. There are plenty of single-family homes already in the West Chatham Neighborhood Center area, and they're going to stay there probably. They may be redeveloped over time, okay, but they can't be single-family homes. The ones that are there can probably maybe have an ADU put in them, that sort of thing. But I would only reiterate that please keep in mind what our vision is, and that is that we create a neighborhood center. We're also wrestling with whether we're going to prohibit short-term rentals, meaning anything less than a year. I'm a strong proponent of that, and they ought to be prohibited. Different ways to do that. We can do it, we understand, but it's absolutely critical, because otherwise we're going to create a lot of small units that are going to be short-term rentals, and nobody will live there, and the commercial area may or may not be successful, don't know. But our objective is to create people who live there, which addresses the housing concerns and demographic shifts that you started with. And really, I guess those are my comments for now. But thank you. Go for it.
No, thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, we have that unfortunate study that said how many we could jam in here, and I think your role is to show what a 12-unit per acre site should look like. It doesn't. We haven't got clear numbers on what number of parking spaces are needed, how much recreation is or green space is needed. The parking is particularly interesting because we have shared use between commercial and residential, so it isn't like we need 2 spaces per home, but we obviously want probably more than 1. But I think you need to give us some representations of how can we make this work, have enough parking for everybody to park, have some green space, and what does a 12 home, or 12 units per acre really look like? And is that feasible? I mean, all right, maybe half of it gets that density and the other half is something else, or is it 20 in one portion of it and 4 in another, rather than just a blanket 12, which was god-awful ugly and nobody. So I'm really encouraged by your designs to try to make that, particularly that one on the left, tell us how that can work at 8 and 12. I would say that would be a really good demonstration.
Yeah.
This is what it's going to look like with keeping it at 8. This is what it will look like at 12. We haven't specified number of bedrooms in each unit. We have some flexibility there. But if you were a designer and you had the ability to do 12 units per acre, what is the most likely plan we would see?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting things you guys have been bringing up. The density is only one of the factors. So the parking requirement, the size of the unit, the amount of commercial, all those things impact all of this, right? So if the units are tiny, 12 of them in one building on an acre probably doesn't look so bad. If the units are huge, 12 of them in one building on an acre probably doesn't look so good. If they all have 4 parking spaces, all you're going to see is a parking lot. There isn't going to be a building associated, right? So I think with a lot of this, we'll definitely look at what's in the code currently. I think we'll test a little bit of these ranges, to try to show you, here's what we drew. This assumed it was 1.5 spaces per unit. So just understand, if you bump that up to 2, another 25% of the site just disappeared for more parking and nothing else changed, right? So I think some of this too, let's not also worry that we have to get the exact perfect condition that we're showing. Anything we show, I think, will be telling, so that when you debate if it was more or if it was less, this would do this or this would do that. So I think 3 sites is also helpful. 1 site put a lot of pressure on 1 site. 3 sites, I think it was suggested maybe we could play with, one's a little bit higher, one's a little bit lower. Maybe we, when we review it with these guys, come up with a strategy for maybe this one's got big units, this one's got little units, this one's got a lot of parking, this one's got a little parking. Whatever is still being debated or is flexible is something we could try to look at.
So I have one more thing that concerns me, and that is, you can design this most beautiful thing to get 12 on there, but is that something that a developer could actually afford to build at, something less than $2 million a unit? So there has to be some consideration of, is this something that would be attractive to a developer to actually build? So
yeah. Yeah, I see this as a bit of a stress test, right? Because I'll look at it and I'll say, here's what your regulations suggest we can do.
Yeah.
Here's where it's flexible, and I'm fighting for the forces of good, so I'm going to do this cool thing. But if I wasn't so great, I might push this, right? And we might be able to identify where those loose ends, where depending on how you read this, you might get away with, which is what you guys are worried about, right? At the end of the day, you guys are thinking about worst case scenario. Like, what's the worst case scenario of this whole thing? So we got to identify where some of those spots are, or at least get you guys to understand there's a little bit of that always built in, but largely it'll probably be pretty great. So we'll see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Charlene?
Always, always love this presentation. I've seen it many times over the years. It should be required viewing, because I think it goes to density. When I was first on the board and you guys were all talking density, I'm like, well, what are you talking about when you mean density? And what I like is that you can show us an 8 or a structure that may have 12 units in it, but it could easily be downsized to 8 units and still have the visual, integrity and look really nice. And I think we need to give some guidance to staff as to, are we still talking the 100 feet, which I think based on our build-out analysis, we need to expand that, for Zone A. And also, I just lost it. Oh, geez, I hate when that happens. But I think we need to, and the 50% rule. I think we need
Mix,
to give
yeah,
the
balance,
mixed
yeah,
use.
yeah.
Because right now, I grabbed which I think is the latest version, which was from June. And right now, what we say is the first floor of the building, the first 30% only needs to be commercial.
That's right, that's it.
And that's it. And I think that's far too little. So I think we need to, you know, we need to give staff guidance so that they can work with the consultant to come up with the vision that we are, I know we're gonna get. I mean, there's no question. And I think you are also gonna do like you did in East Greenwich and go, you know, this really, excuse the expression, this sucks. This would work really great. So there's no doubt that that would happen.
But we do have areas other than the A where it could be all residential. So we do, you should give us both.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I will also suggest that, I know you guys are reacting to the numbers you've been given, which is fair, but also just continuing to think through, make sure you're also not creating conditions that are gonna prevent anybody from doing anything. So like, if you require too much commercial, like if 50% of the building has to be commercial, and I'm not gonna put that on the second or third floor, because I don't wanna put in an elevator, for instance.
Right.
Suddenly, the building's only gonna ever be 2 stories at most, because the ground floor had to be commercial. So it's a tricky thing. So that's why I do think it's ultimately, think about what is the problem, or the one thing I'm most worried about? Is it that I'm worried there's gonna be apartments out on that street instead of, you know, storefronts? Well, the storefronts is the thing we want. It sounds like that's
Right.
what the kind of 30% was
Yes.
imagining. We've been involved with some where it's like, you can do residential on the ground floor, but it has to be convertible to commercial, so that sometime down the road, the plate heights were high enough, whatever the case might be. We don't need to get in the weeds of it, but there are ways of thinking of it. I would just say, always come back to what is the problem you're trying to solve, and make sure you're not overdoing it to try to get at that.
And there may be some creativity in that the back portion of the commercial could actually be an artisan studio where they live and work in the same space, very similar to the Potter.
Chatham, oh, what's his name?
Gil.
Tom, yeah,
First name is Gil.
Gil,
He's
yes.
right there, he's got
Wilson.
his studio, and he's got his residence in the front building, and the back building is his kiln, and he's the parking in between. That to me is an incredible example of, and it's a small parcel, of how to, you know, really utilize a
Right.
parcel.
Well, I think what that sort of caught us on the visuals for the build-out, where they showed the limited retail in the front, or commercial in the front, and the rest was residential. And they were just following what was in the draft bylaw. Their summary on that was, well, we're gonna do 12 for everything, right? 12 residential units for every site there. And we're gonna put this limited commercial in. They said that the commercial would actually reduce from what's existing right now. Now, I don't think that that's where we wanna go. We do wanna grow the commercial a little bit more than what it is right now. So, and by adding also a residential component, and I think that's the reason why, I'm not sure if the 50% is the right number, and I think the information from Union Studios can help guide us on this piece, because you're right about that. There's different contexts as far as parking and landscape and all of that. So I'm not fixed on what that number should be right now. I know it should be better in depth, you know, and some sort of a percentage, and we could name it as a minimum, and then see what that develops into. And again, I think maybe suggesting a couple of different things with staff having their discussion with Union Studios might help us. I think that they're supposed to, at least at this point, just provide us with one visual at each location. Is that right?
Yes, based on the contract.
All right, so it was not the intent that we were gonna do 2 at one location.
No.
So if you wanted to do, as Bob, you were referring to, an 8 and a 12, we would do one side with 8 and another one with 12. So because it's gonna be a challenge to get all this done by the end of next month and still make decisions about final wrap-up.
I mean, the alternative is that you do two on. The alternative is you do two on that first property on the left. One is 12 and one is 8. That's two of the three that we
Okay,
would get.
yeah, and skip aside that.
That actually would be cheaper for them to
Yeah.
do.
I don't agree. Do
Yeah.
the three sides.
Do the three
Alright.
sites, yeah.
Again, I think the other thing I would say is, if you share with these guys what you're ultimately trying to get at, we can, I know you need to provide pretty specific direction, but we can also be a little bit creative about how we try to address the problem you're trying to have addressed. So another way of stating it is, a lot of this is numerical.
Yeah.
Right? So I could draw one scheme, and if I assume the units are bigger, maybe there's fewer units, even though I drew the same thing. Parking, it's a little bit harder to kind of, but I could say in this one, I have more units because my parking count's lower. So in effect, you get more than one yield out of one scheme, if that makes sense. So it could help kind of test some of those limits,
Yeah.
because I understand what you're trying to understand and comprehend.
And that's why I said an 8-unit, a 12-unit building could easily be reduced by changing walls and such in the design to 8 units
Right.
and still have the same character to it.
Yeah. Okay, let's just continue on, and then we'll do a second round if we need to. Frank?
Okay. It's the first time I've seen the presentation. I'm very impressed, and I'm very excited about how you can input into our process and make it better. Personally, I don't think I'd bother with 8. I'd go directly to 12. That's what we've, unless we're going to change it. Unless we're going to change it. If
Well,
we're gonna change it, then
I think that the conversation has to still be that we can't ignore the infrastructure.
No, of course not.
So if you assume that it's 12, that's 12 every place, and I'm not sure that that's a responsible way to go.
Well, I'm
That's my opinion.
All
So
I'm saying
I'm not
if we
interested in just
decide-
doing one style for all three. I think we have to have a couple of different
I'm
ones.
saying that if we decide on 12, we should show 12. If we decide on 8, we should show 8. That's my only point. I'm really interested in any suggestions you have on how we can change what we have put on paper now to make it better, to accomplish all the objectives that the members have set out here.
Yeah.
And I see you haven't been taking notes, but you may have to look through the video because there's an awful lot of input here.
Yeah.
That would be terrific. Just one thought I've got, and this is for the board. The residential buildings in the back and the build-out analysis look to me, from a bird's eye view, because that's all I can see, are big. And one approach would be to say, well, you can't build big buildings. You've got to reduce them. So I was just thought to put out there. So that's it.
Yeah, on that last point, I know that in Eastham, for instance, for a while, I don't know if it's still this way, but in their code, they had a building could only be a maximum of a 3,000 square foot footprint.
That's what I'm thinking.
So it was interesting, because it's like, what are you trying to get at? Is it, we want it to be a village scale building. Does it matter if I put more or fewer walls in there and it's more or fewer units? Or is it more about what is the resulting form that you're concerned about? So some of those things are considerations. Again, I want to see where your current draft is and what sort of things are in there about restrictions, but that speaks to that point, right? That we often think about height as a constraint, but not necessarily the footprint, which also has an impact, so.
Could I just make a comment? I think all of those points are in the most recent draft. We do have a maximum footprint. We also have a maximum front elevation length and maximum, what's the word? Jut outs, or.
Oh, like how the articulation you have to have every so often.
Articulation, yes, I
yeah.
think is 50 feet and maximum in the A zone facing Route 28. It's different in the other zones, but I think the maximum front elevation length is 75 feet with the articulation maximum at 50 feet. I think maximum is 2 stories, and I think there is a maximum building footprint as well and it might be different in each zone, I don't recall. Also, just as I recall, we specify a certain percentage of commercial on the ground floor, and we also specify a certain amount of transparency, that minimum transparency, in other words, storefronts. So that is all specified in the form-based code.
Great.
Yeah. But I do agree with my colleagues that we do want feedback from you anything that we can make the code better to achieve the goals that we want would be better. So, that's all.
Bob? And then we'll go around again.
I want to thank you for your presentation, and that's about all I really have. You guys have chewed this up and chewed it up, spit it out 2 or 3 times. So,
I'll ask one quick question before you go for a second round. We've identified 3 sites, but I think as you point out, there's obviously different conditions when you get around to some of the secondary areas. So is there some consideration to not doing all 3 that have the same Zone A condition? I don't know what you guys were thinking about when you picked these 3. Does it make any sense to do one that's around on one of the side streets that could be all residential? Or do you feel like that's so much more straightforward that this is really where you want to concentrate testing out how it looks? But
My preference is the ones that front on Route 28, but I don't know what the board would like to do.
I'd agree with that. I like the 3 that you've chosen. It's possible this 1652 Main might accommodate more residential in the back, just because of its nature. And I did want to say, what we didn't mention to you is we did just have a meeting with our DPW director about the infrastructure capacity. And I know no one likes to hear this, but the reality is at the current moment, not thinking of infrastructure improvements that could be done in the future, but at the current moment, the pump stations cannot handle 8 units per acre, cannot handle 12 units per acre. They cannot even handle 5 units per acre. There was another study done on this area back in 2014 when Cape Cod Commission worked with us on the visioning study for Route 28, and the density that they used was 4 units per acre. So technically, right now, the infrastructure capacity is not at 8 units or 12, it's at 4 units per acre.
yeah,
However, that being said, it would be a matter of course that infrastructure is improved in the future, but right now, that's what we're looking at. And I think that's a decision the board has to make. Do we do these visuals on a projected future, or what the infrastructure can handle right now? So I know it's not a very happy, it's not something that we're happy to look at, but I think we have to. And I don't know how much of a difference this makes and if I'm correct in this or not. But for example, there are some of the businesses who are in place now who have been there for generations, and they're somewhat iconic to Chatham. Of course, anything could change at any time, but it might be nice to include those in the redevelopment of those areas. Of course, we can't predict, but one of them is Larry's PX. Another one might be Cream and Cone. The post office might stay in place in any redevelopment scenario. Those are 3 that I'd suggest would stay in place.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good suggestion. And that was actually a big driver in Eastham when we did the master plan with the town.
Yeah.
We have existing tenants here. We don't want to imagine this means they have
Right.
to go. And
Right.
actually, there's a lot of time spent like, okay, you could phase this so they could move into that space and, all that kind of stuff. Because it is an important consideration. They are
Yeah.
usually local institutions. They're often local business owners, right? It's the residents you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Okay, follow-up questions? Anything from you, Warren?
Only to indicate that once we have the perfect draft zoning, we'd like all the help we can get in how you sell this to the town voters. Because if you say density, the answer is no.
Right.
And I don't think that's the right answer, but any guidance you can include in this as to how you go forward between now and town meeting to build a consensus that this is a very positive proposal.
Yeah.
Would be helpful.
Bob?
Yeah, so one area that we didn't discuss here is the setback. We've talked a little bit about some setback for the businesses so they could have restaurants and other things like that. We haven't totally clarified what that is, but you should give us what you think is going to really work, given the nature of that area. I'm going to disagree very much with Catherine that we should even consider anything but the 12. I will point out to her that even with that maximum design, the achieved density was 5.9 units per acre. That was the worst case scenario in that study. We're not talking about anything that's crazy, because you're not going to be able to make it 12 if you put in parking and you put in the other. Yeah,
No, I want to correct you on that. That was for 8 units.
8 units.
So at 12, now you're talking about 8.9 dwelling
Okay,
units. per
8
acre.
to 8, all right. So in any case, it's not, if we go, it's not 12, it's not 12 per acre over the whole thing. The issues that we heard from today should not in any way stop us from doing what we are intending to do here, which is develop a plan for the next 50 years. The fact that we may have to put a pumping station in early should not have any more mention about stopping what we're trying to do here. But just please, I do think we want to see a residential only, just because people need to understand what a good residential only plan can look like in that area. I don't know.
The only place that would occur would be on the side street, where then you would be allowed to have only
Well, I was
residential.
thinking of the B, but if we only went with these 3, then it is commercial in front on each of these 3 properties. So I guess we have the mixed use on all 3 of these. Forget what I said about residential only. And then I would only say to Frank, the only reason we do want to do 12, but part of our decision as to whether we can do that is how it looks. And so if we only get pictures of all of these 3 properties at 12, we have no idea how it might be different if it was an 8. So I'm going to let you be the judge of what you want to show us. Make these 3 properties look as nice as they can. Make it, give things that the town is going to say, I really, because Warren's absolute, we have to sell this to the public.
Yeah.
And they have to be, wow, wouldn't that be so much better than what we have right now?
Yeah.
And that's what we're counting on you to do.
Yeah.
Okay, Charlene?
One of the things the build-out analysis did not take into consideration are those green spaces.
Yeah.
Are those recreation areas for children that may be living in these homes now? So that's one thing that did not take into consideration that we definitely want to include in visualizations, because I think that is just extremely important.
Yeah.
Other than that, I got nothing more.
Okay. Follow-up, Frank?
Yeah, I wouldn't take anything as a given. If you see anything that we should change, please come back. And I agree with Bob. I think we should stick with the 12. I think you said it very well, so I'm not going to repeat it. That's it.
Well, I think Charlene had a point. If you have smaller units in the building at 12, and you say, okay, it's only 8 units per acre, you can make the units larger in square feet, and they're not downsized, but they'll have less units. So if you take a look at it from that perspective, it may not change that much. A developer might come across and says, I need the square footage, otherwise I'm never going to be able to rent these or sell these or whatever. So they're going to dictate a little bit associated with this, and that might dictate how many units end up.
Yeah, what's becoming very clear to me, the more I learn, is that 12 is not very dense. So I'll just put that out.
Okay. Well, I think Katie, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
So just a couple of things. So one, we'll certainly get Jeremy the most recent copy. Jeremy and I have been speaking for over a year now, so that's probably why he has an older version of the bylaw. So we just signed the contract, as he indicated this week. But we've been anticipating this coming along. None of the form content of the bylaw had changed. What had really changed was the wording around the number of units for housing and whether or not there were special permits and things like that. So the form really hadn't changed. So I think that is relatively or almost exactly the same as what had been sent before. I think that, just the expectation, and I think that, Jeremy, you had mentioned that you need at least about 6 weeks to kind of come up with something.
Yeah.
And so I just want to put that, make sure that the board is aware of that as we're looking toward town meeting. At some point in time, fairly soon after that, we will need to advertise a public hearing. And we need to come to some decision points. And I think that the board, I think we need to figure out exactly what that is. The commercial, the depth of the A1, the amount of commercial space. And, coming to some realizations on the number of units per acre. I think that, the board just needs to make those decisions so that we can move this forward. And so I just wanted to put that out there because we're at December 9th, and if we're waiting for the visualizations to be able to make those decisions, we're really cutting it close because that's the end of January, beginning of
If
February.
I could add one more thing, if we do reduce the density from 12 to 8, we're going to have to rethink the bonuses completely. And
Of
that's-
course.
Yeah, so it's
course.
it's that, and that's probably the hardest part of all.
Yeah.
Well, I really, to me, and it comes down to what's going to happen is how many parking spaces per unit. Because putting 12 on there is not the problem. Putting 12 on there with 2 parking spaces and trying to get some green space in there is going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, parking is the one you can't hide.
Yeah.
In other words, with the buildings, the images I showed you, units could be bigger, smaller, stacked, whatever. Parking is parking. A 12 unit, a 12 parking spot lot looks like any other 12 parking lot spot. If it doubles, it doubles. There's not gonna be underground, there's not gonna be structured, there's not gonna be any of that stuff, right? So in a way, that is ultimately, I always say, I hate to say it, but a lot of the work I do is ultimately driven by parking. I gotta solve that first, and I gotta do the best I can do with that and work around it, create something with it, but,
Okay.
yeah.
I think we can open it up to the public now. If there is anyone who would like to comment, raise your hand, or?
I would just like to thank you all.
Up, come to the mic.
Come on up.
Yeah, I'm Rick Levitt from West Chatham, and you all know me as a spokesperson for West Chatham for a number of years. The direction you're going in, I think, is just outstanding. Keep it up. We'll get this done. And I want to thank Union Studio and Katie and Mike for helping to bring Union Studio here.
Yep.
The presentation was just outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to definitely have more opportunities once visualizations come in so that you can get reactions, and that might be what gets some more input from the public. We do need to take these out to the public after we do have some of the information from you, and we refine what we're doing
Yeah.
with the number of, the setbacks and everything else.
Mr. Chairman, we also have Mr. Buckley online. Stephen Buckley would like to say something.
Okay, Stephen, would you like to comment at all?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much. In 2003, I was on the long-range planning committee that came up with the comprehensive plan. And at that time, I was living on my late father's property, which now is going to be the 40B, right on the edge of the zone that you're talking about. And living there at the time, I had said, someday, and this is going to be developed. And I'm glad to say that it will be shortly. And And actually, it's something that was designed under contract, designed by Union Studio under contract to Penrose. So they might have put something else in there, but I just wanted to say that keep in mind that I thought that would be like a margin or the middle housing. I thought that there would be a dense village center and then a ring, around that, including what is the former Buckley property. So, but now I just want to point out that there's going to be 16 units per acre on the former Buckley property. So it's going to look, if you were talking 12, that's a good middle area to be able to say a little bit more, a little bit less. But I just wanted to remind you that the center of gravity is going to shift as far as the village center goes. Then, and so anyway, I just wanted to remind people you're talking 12, and or even 8, and that's going to be. But the former Buckley property is on. It's going to be a 40B with 16. So, and the other part is that as far as marketing it goes, I would say that it really should be remind people that we have a very popular downtown village area that people come so they can walk around. They park and then they get to walk all around and do all kinds of things. And perhaps you could even say it's a victim of its own success, because when I grew up in Chatham, there were more people living in apartments downtown than there are now. So if it could be a little bit more mixed with, an actual living area as opposed to looking more like a theme park for quaint New England village. If it was a little more vibrant, I'm hoping that's what, and I'm bullish that Union Studio will do something very nice, because I've been following them for a long time, and I'm glad that they're involved now, and also with the former Buckley property. So those are my thoughts. And to say that, just remind people, if there's something downtown, an aspect that can remind people of, hey, what if we did downtown up here in West Chatham? I don't think anybody's going to say, oh, that's terrible downtown. We don't want it to look like downtown. I'm trying to, that's one way to sell it, is to say more of what we already know works. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Katie, anyone else raise their hand? I don't see anybody.
I don't see anyone.
I did want to just state, I had one more slide that I'm not going to show, but it was, stay tuned, because my colleague Paul will be here next week talking about those Penrose projects I know with you guys.
Yeah.
And so I do think this was, I'll show it. Not that it's all that exciting. It was just to say, coming soon, affordable and attainable housing at Main Street and Meeting House Road. So a lot of things we talked about tonight are going to be on display here. I'm not going to steal Paul's thunder. He's going to walk you through the whole thing and what was considered and rejected. But I do think it is interesting to think if this one is if that's 16 units to an acre, it gives you a little bit of a visual that there is some open space, fair number of units, the parking that's required. One thing that doesn't have is a commercial component.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about, it's not apples to apples, 12 with a commercial component. It's not the same as 16 without a commercial component. So, but in any case. All right.
Okay. I think we can close out tonight then. Do I have a
We
motion?
had 2 things in our packet. I'm just wondering why we got them.
I talked to Christine about this. She said that we receive information like this from adjacent towns on a regular basis. They provide it to us. There's nothing that we really have to do with it. It's just to give us information about what they're doing. So unless there's a reason for us to actually bring it up as a topic, it's there for information. And if the board members would like to discuss whatever it is, we can put it on an agenda for a future meeting.
I want to see A&W back, not a bagel hound.
All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Do a roll call vote. Catherine Halpern,
Yes, I approve.
Warren Jane,
Warren Chain, approve.
Bob Werschafter,
Approve.
Charlene
Approved.
Greenhouse. Thank you. Frank Shear
Approve.
and Bob Dubus
Approve.
and Art Spru, I approve. and the time is 6:55. Did I get that right tonight? 6:55 PM.